Hey everybody, this is chapter 7 of OK for Now. This chapter is titled The Fork-Tailed Petrel. This is the little picture there of the fork-tailed petrel. It appears to be two birds that are falling. So we'll see how that is symbolized as we read the story here. But yes, last time we read, as a quick recap, finally, the brother that has been mentioned many times throughout the story, Lucas, has finally come home from the war. Lucas has two very severe injuries. He has lost his legs and he is blinded. So both very horrific things. The father is his typical self, and he wants no part of it. He doesn't even help him get into the van. He doesn't help him get into the house. But a character who does turn around during that scene is Christopher, who suddenly has a really nice change of heart. He seems to be suddenly becoming a really good brother. Also, for the first time, we are told the name of Christopher. And I want you guys to think, what does that mean? Why did the author wait till right now to finally tell us his name? What could that symbolize? The fact that we now have learned the name Christopher. So, with that, let's get started. Do you know how often it snows in stupid Marysville during a winter? Once a week, maybe twice. And do you know on what day of the week it always snows? Saturday. Every Saturday for most of January and on into February. Every Saturday. Do you remember what I have to do on Saturday mornings? And do you think that delivery stopped just because it's snowing and blowing and blizzarding and the snow isn't turning into slush like it would on a Long Island and getting deeper and deeper? And the cold is so bad that Joe Pepitone's jacket doesn't help much at all, and my fingers are starting to stick to the handles on that wagon. So I have to pull Joe Pepitone's sleeves down over my hands, but I don't have anything for my eyes, which were about to snap off. And Mr. Loeffler gave me this gray wool cap that Lil says looks great on me, but I think personally it makes me look like a chump. But you know what? I wear it anyways because I really don't want my ears to snap off. And besides, did you hear that I mentioned that Lil says it looks great on me? Every Saturday, it was the same. I'd wake up and it would still be dark because the clouds were thick and it was already snowing hard. And it had just been snowing hard for most of the night, so the ground was covered and the sidewalks and the streets too. While Lucas and Christopher slept, I'd put on about everything I had beneath Joe Pepitone's jacket. And then I'd put on the gray wool cap that Lil says looks great on me. And I'd lace up my sneakers, and then I'd head out into that snow. And my feet would be cold and wet in 3 steps. Mr. Spicer always had a cup of hot chocolate for me to start off each of the runs. And I'd drink it, and I'd go out for the first load. But in the beginning of January, I did this with the wagons. But pretty soon, Mr. Spicer figured that I'd do a whole lot better with his old toboggan he had instead. So that's what I'd use. And went a whole lot quicker, too. I'm not lying. But you can't believe how cold the wind can blow in stupid Marysville. Mrs. Vason always had a cup of warm milk waiting for me because I told her like a chump that Mr. Spicer always started me off with a thing of hot chocolate. And she wanted to be sure to give me something different, she said. So it was hot milk. But I got used to it. Mr. Loeffler always had a cup of hot tea waiting for me. And I got used to that, too. Mrs. Doherty always had a bowl of cream wheat waiting for me. But I did not get used to that. Phronsie whispered that it was good for you, but a whole lot of brown sugar on it, and she said it actually wasn't bad with that. She lied. It wasn't. Mrs. Windermere always had a cup of hot coffee waiting for me, black, which she said was the only way to drink it if you wanted to be awake to serve the god of creativity, which she needed to do a whole lot since she was working on a stage adaptation of Guess. That's right, Jane Eyre. I'm not lying. And when I told her that the only people who read Jane Eyre were the people who had to read it in their English classes, she said no, and I also told her that no one in their right mind was going to pay good money to sit in the front of the stage and have it all acted out. She just sipped her coffee and said, "Skinny delivery boy, I'm not even finished with it, and people have already lining up to buy tickets." Can you imagine anyone buying tickets to Jane Eyre? Can you imagine Joe Pepitone buying tickets to Jane Eyre? Me neither. But I spent that winter with my head down against the wind, pulling that stupid toboggan, my hands up Joe Pepitone's sleeves, and always having to go to the bathroom because of the cold and the warm hot chocolate, milk, tea, and coffee. But afterwards, when I got to Mrs. Windermere's, Lil would be waiting for me at the deli, and Mr. Spicer would heat up some chicken noodle soup for us, his own recipe with lots of chicken and onion. And I'd take off the sopping sneakers and lay them beside the radiator, and I would take off my sopping socks and lay them on the radiator, and I'd stretch my sopping feet as close as I could get to that radiator, and then I'd eat the chicken noodle soup until I was warm again. And then we go up to the library where Mr. Powell was waiting for us and where we started to work on gesture. Which, by the way, the snowy heron would have been good for, but it was gone now too because of the snow. I'm not lying. Stupid Marysville had so much snow that winter that the town ran out of money to pay for plowing and salting and sanding. So town council went over to the library like it was a bank or something, and they took a razor blade with them. And the next time Mr. Powell came in, the snowy heron, it was cut out, and they had sold it for money. Just like that, they'd sold off somewhere to pay for more plowing and salting and sanding. And if you're trying to get Audubon's pages back and stupid Marysville is selling off faster than you can find them, it gets sort of discouraging. So here are the stats on Volume 3 of John James Audubon's Bird of America, owned by the Marysville Free Public Library of stupid Marysville, New York. Total number of plates, 100. The Arctic Tern, missing, sold to an anonymous collector from overseas. The Red-Throated Diver and Mrs. Windermere's box. The Large-Billed Puffin, missing, Mr. Powell won't tell me where. The Brown Pelican and Principal Petey's office. The Yellow Shank, returned by Mr. Ballard, who is a good guy. The Snowy Heron, missing, Mr. Powell won't tell me where that one is either. Total removed from the books, 6. Total returned, 1. Total to be returned, total that will soon be returned to the Birds of America, 5. Terrific. When you're considering gesture, you're not imagining the birds as if they're posing for you. You imagine them moving across the page instead of staying put. Your pencil is going to show them not only at the moment of the picture, but the moment before the moment that is going to come after. I looked up at Mr. Powell. He started to laugh. Try this. You're not going to draw a picture of a bird. You're going to draw a picture of the bird's flight line. How do I do that? Don't think of the bird as a flat image. Think of it the whole way around, even if the parts that you don't see. Then think of how all the different pieces of the bird are working with or against each other. Think how the body of the bird wants to fall. And the wings want to keep it up? Exactly. And how do I do that? That was when we looked at the fork-tailed petrels. Things at Washington Irving Junior High School were going mostly okay. My geography of the story of the world was as clean as you can have it expect halfway through the year. Mr. Barber still checked it out, though, leaning down over me when I was working on the chapter review, map about India. I could smell his coffee, and even thought it didn't smell as good as Mrs. Windermere's, which she percoded because I came. It still smelled pretty good. In world history, Mr. McElroy had found 8 film strips about the history of the Philippines. The record pinged way at us just about every class. Psh, terrific. And in English, Miss Cowper was throwing us into the introduction of poetry unit like it was all fired important as the moonshot. You know, there are good reasons to learn how to read poetry. There are a lot of good reasons to learn how to read, but poetry is not one of them. I mean, so what if 2 roads go ways into wood? So what? Who cares if it all made that big of a difference? What difference? And why should I have to guess what the difference is? Isn't that the way he's supposed to say? Why can't poets just say what they want to say and then shut up? In math, Mr. Verne selected a group of students who had shown excellence and promise to work together on advanced algebra. Guess who was in it? That's right, and Lil too. You know how that feels? In Mr. Ferris's physical science class, we were distilling aspirins, very large aspirins, which by the time the last bell rang, Mr. Ferris says he needed. Clarence was rocking his little hooves off these days because the moonshot was still on go-ahead, and it looked like it wouldn't be long before there were human footprints on the lunar surface, as Mr. Ferris kept reminding us. When we asked him if making aspirin was as important as men going to the moon, he rubbed his head and looked kind of painfully at us and said, "Believe me, aspirin is pretty darn important." And in case you're wondering how things have been going with Coach Reed, January and February were mostly okay too. I filled in all the presidential physical fitness charts for him in both periods. He'd call out the numbers and I'd write them down where they were supposed to be. And when he had to do the written comments at the end of the charts, he told me what to write. And I did it. I told him maybe my spelling wasn't going to be all that terrific, but he said he didn't care. And a few days into this, he brought me a new gym shirt so that I didn't have to wear my undershirt anymore. He handed it to me one morning after we finished the period chart. Thanks. My brother isn't talking much these days, and he dreams a lot. Go shower. You're going to be late for your next class. There are two fork-tailed petrels. They're in the middle of a green, stormy sea, and the waves are about as high as they're flying. They're heading closer, and their sharp beaks are open because they're calling to each other kind of desperately. Look at the way the wind is blowing the waves, said Mr. Powell. Anything odd about it? I shook my head. Look again. Pay attention to the composition. And he was right. Two winds were blowing the waves in two directions, completely apart. So how are the birds' bodies responding to those winds? The two winds are pushing them in different directions, but the petrels were just using them to meet in the center of the picture. That's what the picture was about, meeting, even though you might be headed in different directions. See, all movement relies on that kind of tension, you know? Because of the snow, we missed most of Lucas's appointments in Kingston. My father said he didn't want to have the chance of driving off the highway and that stuff, and he wasn't about to take a day off just for a doctor's appointment, not with Mr. Big Bucks Ballard breathing down his neck. So Lucas would have to do the best he could. My mother did the best she could by calling up the doctor's office and asking what to do, and filling the prescription for the ointment for Lucas's eyes and checking the stumps every day to be sure there was no redness or smell of infection. You can imagine how that was like. Lucas mostly just sat around the kitchen with a blanket over his lap. Not because he was cold. He didn't talk hardly at all. None of us could know what it was like, he said. We weren't there. So what was the point of talking? When he did talk, he was the old jerk self again. And when I told him about the moonshot and how one day there was going to be human footprints on the lunar surface, he said, I guess they won't be mine. And when my mother asked me to run down to Spicer's Deli for milk, he said, I would like to run with you, but... And when Christopher said that he was thinking about going for track in the spring, which is something like a miracle since Christopher has never gone for anything in his whole life, Lucas said, I bet I would be able to run off my legs right off if I tried. Oh, wait a minute. My legs are already gone. Every time he said something, that was the last thing anyone said for a long time. It got pretty awkward, which is what probably happened the second Saturday afternoon when I've been working on the gestures of the fork-tailed petrels, and I was starting to get them just right so that they looked like they were about to dance with each other. And I came back home, and I said to my mother and Christopher, I think I got them dancing. And Lucas said, I bet you couldn't do that for me. And suddenly the silence came down, and I thought of that yellow shank, and I said, Shut up, Lucas. I'm not lying. I said, Shut up, Lucas. He turned his face towards me. What did you just say? Oh, are you deaf too? I said. He threw his blanket off his lap, and he tried to raise himself off the wheelchair. You listen, little brother. Oh, I can hear. I have no problems with that, I said. I got my legs blown off in case you forgot. How could we forget? You remind us every second of every day. I think if Lucas was able to get out of that chair at that moment, he would have pulled my face right off. My mother had her hand up to her mouth, but she didn't stop us. The thing about the fork-tailed petrels is that they only have a moment. The winds are blowing opposite ways, and each one is riding a different wind, and there's only this one moment that they can meet. It's all fired important. They can't miss it when it comes either. And this was that moment for Lucas and I. Doug, Lucas said. He said it in a kind of snarl. You don't even try, I said. Try what? More snarling. I can't grow my new legs. What do you expect from me? You have 2 arms. They used to be strong. Yeah, you used to be able to even take me, Christopher said. And the doctor said that you should try taking those bandages off my eyes. Your eyes, too. Maybe. I'm blind! I walked over to my brother. I reached for the bandage across his eyes, and then he felt me near him. He tried to stop me, snarling. But I was a lot stronger than him now. I hadn't thought about that, but I was. So I grabbed his arms, I pushed him away, and I pulled the bandages off. At this moment, my mom started to cry. Most of Lucas's face was still in the shiny pink of the half-healed skin. His eyes glistened with the ointment smeared over them. There were no eyebrows, no lashes, and his eyes blinked and blinked and blinked. You want to stop me, I said, or maybe I snarled, actually. Try! Hit yourself up in that wheelchair and try to stop me right now, brother. But he didn't move. He just kept blinking. Try, said Christopher. Lucas blinked again, and he turned his face towards my mother. I think I see you, he said. That next Saturday, it snowed. But it didn't matter. Christopher and I carried Lucas into the pickup, and Lucas, my mother, and my father drove to Kingston early. Lucas didn't have the bandage over his eyes. He just kept turning his face from side to side, blinking and trying to make things out. And he was smiling. I already told you about his smile, right? And after the deliveries, I drew that four-tailed petrels with smiles. Birds, Mr. Powell said, tend not to have expressions on their face. Yeah, this is their one chance. In a second, they're going to be blown past each other, and who knows what's going to happen to them next. This is the only time they can be together. Mr. Powell leaned into my drawing. In that case, I guess smiles are appropriate. But none of that petrol smiles could touch Lucas's smile or my mother's smile when I got home that afternoon, or mine probably when I heard about the Kingston doctor, what he really thought that Lucas's eyes might heal all the way, and he was going to send him to a specialist down in Middleton. He was going to send him all the way to some specialists in New York City, but I set him straight about that one, said my father. And meanwhile, the doctor had some exercises he wanted Lucas to really work at for his arms and upper chest, and Lucas said, I may need your help, little brother. And I said, sure. He reached out his hand, and I shook it, and his fan felt strong. You know, I don't think the four-tailed petrels are blowing past each other. The more I think about it, it seems to me that they're probably circling, like two wrestlers would, like I used to, remember? And when those waves and the wind smack at them, they spread their wings and skitter around, and then they try to come back together again. That's what I think they're doing. On Monday, James Russell was counting the squat thrusts on the physical fitness test chart when he said, I hear you've been drawing birds at the library. Yep, I said, kind of breathless. It's hard to talk when you're doing as many squat thrusts as you can in 4 minutes. Audubon stuff? He asked. I nodded. Some of those plates are missing from that book, he said. I nodded again. I was at 63 and still had about a minute to go, which if you ask me isn't too bad. I know where one of them is, he said. I nodded again. Principal Petey's office. I figured he'd seen the brown pelican too. Puffins, he said. At that moment, I stopped my squat thrust. My father bought it from the town. I'm not lying. I had another 42 squat thrusts before Coach Reed even could call time. If I had James Russell's father's job, I wouldn't talk about it. Probably James felt the same way because he never talked about it. And when he told me what it was, he said that it was only telling me because I probably figured it out the minute I walked into his house. But I couldn't talk about it to anyone, he said. Promise. I told him I'd keep it secret. And probably you shouldn't tell anyone either, so shh. James Russell's father is the first flutist of the New York Philharmonic. Do you know what my father would say if he knew that this guy was a flutist? My father wouldn't be too kind. And James was right. You could tell as soon as you walked into that house. I mean, how many houses have flute music playing on the stereo in the middle of the afternoon and playing loud too? And how many houses have books and flutes right out at the coffee table that anyone could write off? And sheet music everywhere, and this huge piano, and next to it a music stand with a silver flute across it. I'm not lying. You can tell pretty quickly. What you might not be able to tell pretty quickly when you first met Mr. Russell is that he is the first flutist of the New York Philharmonic, because Mr. Russell is bigger than Joe Pepitone and Mickey Mantle put together. And I don't mean he's fat, because he isn't. He's just huge. He stands over you like a mountain, and he's got dark, beady shrubbery all over the peak, and arms like pines, and legs like oaks, and feet the size of small lakes. His hands look too big to hold anything out but a boulder, one in each. I said, You play the flute? And he said, Sweetly and beautifully. Then he showed me, and he was right. He played the flute pretty sweetly and beautifully. He started with Mozart, who isn't as bad as you might think, and then some Brahms, who is as bad as you might think. And then some Joplin, who's good, and some Aaron Copland, who Mr. Russell said was my favorite composer, though he didn't write anything for a flutist. And then he did some Beatles stuff. It didn't exactly sound like Beatles, but it wasn't bad. And when he finished, I asked him to play Copland again, and he smiled, and he did. Copland knew how to say what he wanted to say, unlike certain poets that I wasn't going to mention again now. Then James took me upstairs. He had a house big enough to fit 14 dumps, maybe more. His own room was the size of our downstairs, and he had his own bathroom and tile with a grout still around it. And on the third floor, they had this room that ran the whole length of the house, about as big as the left field of the stadium, which I would have walked on, by the way. And right where the stairs came up the room was the large billed puffin. That's where it was hanging. All right, this is going to sound dumb. You know, sometimes when you haven't seen something for a long time and suddenly there he is and you look at him and for a second it's almost like he's a stranger and then that second is gone and everything's all the same again. Sort of like Hauling Hood came by when he dropped off Joe Pepitone's jacket last summer. That's exactly what happened, except at that same moment Mr. Russell was downstairs playing the Copland piece again. And there were those fat puffins still looking like the chumps that I remember them to be, bumbling around like they had no idea how to get out of the world. Looking dumb and stupid and so beautiful that I wanted to... Nothing. They're kind of dumb looking, aren't they? Said James Russell. Yeah, I said. I couldn't take my eyes off them, though. And still, that music played sweetly. They don't even look like they can swim, he said. And meanwhile, that music played beautifully behind us. Tuesday after school, I went home to do all the homework that I wouldn't be able to do that night because Mrs. Dorley had called and wondered if I could come over in short notice. So now I had the Doherty kids to read to, and we were up at this place where the spider is going to die and a pig was about to get her egg sac. I know, this story sounds pretty dumb, doesn't it? But it wasn't bad. So I had to get all the homework done before I went, especially for Mrs. Verne, who had already dropped 2 people from the advanced algebra class because she didn't get all their assignments in on time. And I wasn't going to be number 3. But on Wednesday, I went home with James Russell. It was raining, and we got pretty wet walking home with Otis Bottom, too, since his house is only a couple blocks away from James Russell's. And for the record, Otis Bottom's father has a job you could talk about because he's a doctor, which explains why his house is not on the same side of town as the dump. I guess that being a doctor and being a flutist with the New York Philharmonic paid pretty well. At James Russell's house, we visited the large-billed puffins like they were old friends. Then we played speed chess up on the 3rd floor, which I'm no good at, but he didn't wipe me out too fast because he's a good guy. And he had a great dartboard up there too, and I only threw a few into the wall instead of the actual target. And then we played regular chess, and I was better, but he still won. And all the while, Mr. Russell was playing Copland downstairs, and that stupid puffins were still bobbling out in the water sweetly and beautifully on top of the steps. On Thursday, I stayed late with Coach Reed to finish the presidential fitness charts. Thanks, he said, and he signed his name on the last one. Sure, I said. I stood up to go. Swiatek, yeah? How's your brother doing? You surprised he asked me this? His eyes are getting better. That's what I mean. That's not what I mean. I know. He still has those dreams. Coach Reed looked at me for a while, his mouth working. Go on home, and thanks for writing up the charts. Then the fork-tailed petrels flew a little bit closer together at that moment for me. We were finally getting at the same level. Do you dream too? I said. Coach Reed looked down. He started to fuss with some bags of softballs. A long time with the fussing, and then he said, There was a kid while I was over there, younger than you. More fussing with the softballs. And an old man and a young girl, probably the kid's sister, I don't know. Fussing with softballs again. They visit me every night. Yeah, I think that's what it's like for Lucas, too, I said. He shook his head. I don't think so. Not like these there. Maybe they want you to do something, I said. He stopped fussing with the softballs. Maybe they want you to help someone else. Maybe then they'll stop visiting you. He looked at me. Maybe they do, he said. And that's what I mean about the fork-tailed petrels circling around and around each other until they finally meet. On Saturday, we had another snowstorm. Terrific. Before I even left the house, there was 8 inches on the ground, and I'm not talking light and fluffy here either. I looked out the bedroom window, and I said to Lucas, who was already doing his exercise at the side of the bed, I'm going to be soaked up to my knees in 3 steps. And he said, that wouldn't happen to me. I know, it sounds like the same old Lucas, but if you had been there, you would have seen that he was smiling when he said it, so it was cool. I was, by the way, soaked up to my knees in 2 steps, and it hadn't stopped snowing, the sun hadn't come out, and the sky hadn't started to blue over on the top of the mountains. I might have said forget it and headed home, but I didn't. I drank my hot chocolate at Spicer's Deli, and then I set out again, and Mrs. Mason was waiting with her hot milk, and I got through it. Mr. Loeffler had a cupboard door that was loose, a light bulb that needed changed over the basement stairs, and a cracked window pane in the bookcase that he needed me to take the glass out of it very, very carefully, and which he couldn't do because of his shaky hands. Mrs. Doherty was keeping my bowl of cream wheat hot, and she had a special treat with it. She said it was bananas. In the whole story of the world, bananas have never once been a special treat. And then I headed to Mrs. Windermere's, where I knew coffee would be percolating. No matter how wet and cold you are, black coffee percolating is always going to be able to get you through it. But I was pretty wet and cold by the time I went there. Wet and cold all the way through. And even with Mr. Loeffler's gray wool cap, which I only wore because Lil Spicer said I looked good in it, which you might remember if you were paying attention earlier, my ears were still about to fall off. I guess you can imagine what Lucas would have said if he heard that. But now, he would have said it while he was smiling. The coffee really was percolating at Mrs. Windermere's in that kitchen, and the kind of warm that goes right into you like a blanket. I could hear Mrs. Windermere typing. Probably Jane Eyre was falling in love with Mr. Rochester right there on her typewriter. And so I put away the groceries, and I took 2 cups out from the cupboard, and I poured the coffee, and I brought the cups into her study. I opened the door, and I sat down near her, just so you could see the vibrations of her typewriter on the coffee. And then I sat down, I sipped at mine, and was almost halfway done before she looked up at me. Jane Eyre is falling in love with Mr. Rochester, she said. See? But I'm not quite sure how this is going to show it on stage. Maybe he should be over at a desk drawing something. Drawing something? And she comes up behind me and she sees what he's drawing and she thinks he's pretty cool. Well, what happens next? I don't know. He doesn't have any idea what to say to her. Well, maybe he should let her draw something with him, Mrs. Windermere said. Maybe, I said. Mrs. Windermere nodded and turned quickly to her typewriter and began smacking at those keys again. Her hands flew high and petrels were going in the wind. I sipped my coffee and I was finished with it. I got up and walked around the table in her study. It was still piled high with books. It would probably always be filled with books. But the difference was I could read them now. Not that I want to read these particular books, but I could have if I wanted to, and that made all the difference. I'm not lying. But I don't know who would want to read these librettos of great operas. Snore. Life of Verdi. Boring. Aku, which sounds like somebody sneezing. History of the Old South Church. Boston. Snore, snore, snore. Even percolated black coffee wouldn't keep you awake if you were trying to read these. So I picked up Aku and I looked at the book beneath it. Aaron Copland's Autobiography, Manuscript Edition. And I read it again. Aaron Copland's Autobiography, Manuscript Edition. I picked it up, and Mrs. Windermere was still typing. I opened the book, and inside the front cover was a sheet of music that was past handwritten. I couldn't read any of it. Maybe I should try that next. Mrs. Windermere stopped typing. What book is that? Aaron Copland's, the guy who writes music. You mean the guy who tries to write music, she said. I looked at her at that. Skinny delivery, boy. You are talking to a very old woman who doesn't think good music has been written since Ludwig van Beethoven finished his 9th symphony. She turned back to her typing and her hands rose high. So why do you have this book? My husband liked to collect quirky books. That one page has Copland's music written in his own hand, but neither he nor I ever read that thing. Me because I never wanted to, and him, he never had the time. Her hands came down. Mrs. Windermere, I said, don't make an old lady cry. What kind of ice cream did I order? Cherry vanilla, I said. She stood up. Well, let's go try some then. Mrs. Windermere, if you don't want the book much, I think I could use it. She looked at me. Do you like Copland? I do, but it's not for me. You have something up your sleeves, don't you? She said. And I told her. Mrs. Windermere smiled, almost like my mother. which kind of surprised me. The god of creativity has folded his wings by your desk too, she said. She took the book, held it lightly to her lips, and kissed it. It wasn't weird. It was just beautiful. She didn't hand it to me. Nothing should ever sit and gather dust, she said, and she went to the kitchen and tried the cherry vanilla ice cream. And on my way home, I carried that Aaron Copland's autobiography manuscript edition to with underneath Joe Pepitone's jacket so nothing could happen to it. And when I got to the library, I showed it to Lil and I told her my plan. But I didn't show it to Mr. Powell. Mr. Swiatek, I think I can accept having the petrol smile a little bit, but that is an out-of-control grin that I see on you there. I guess it is, I said. Rather like you are doing right now, he said. I guess, I said. Mr. Powell looked at Lil. And you too, young lady. At this, Lil started to laugh. She looked over at me and she laughed harder too. And I started laughing. Then Lil came up behind me and saw what I was drawing, and she put her hand on my arm and she squeezed. Do you know what that feels like? I think you two know something that I don't know, he said. And Lil squeezed again. On Monday, I went to James Russell's house. Mr. Russell was playing the Aaron Copland music, and I called the one I called Fabulous. Mr. Russell made us both sit down with a glass of milk. And I have a special treat for you, she said. I'm not lying, she really said that. I held my breath because the last special treat was at Doherty's, but it didn't help because when Mr. Russell came back, she came back with a loaf of banana bread. Banana bread! And James said, how about we have some of that jam with that? And Mrs. Russell said, jam? Then you wouldn't be able to taste the bananas. Ma, I hate bananas. And then she said, but I'm sure that Doug enjoys them. And I said, I think I'm still full from lunch, so the milk's fine. And then Mrs. Russell picked up the plate with the banana bread on it. And you might not believe this, but she started to laugh. And that laugh, until Mr. Russell came into the kitchen to see what was so funny. And then she showed him the banana bread, and he said, I hate bananas. And we all laughed again. And Mr. Russell says, I hate bananas. Or Mrs. Russell said, I hate bananas too. And you can imagine all of us laughing until we were crying. And finally, Mr. Russell took the banana bread outside to break it for the birds. Let's hope they like the bananas at least. And at that moment, I showed him the Aaron Copland's autobiography manuscript edition. And at that, he stopped laughing. Remember how I told you how big his hands are? How they could carry boulders? Well, he held up Aaron Copland's autobiography manuscript edition like it was a half-cracked egg. I heard of this book, but I never thought... He was talking like he would talk before Mass. He opened the front page, looked at the front paper, pasted in. Is this Aaron Copland's own handwriting? He asked. Yes, I said. Mr. Russell stared at it and then he looked at me, smiling, and he went to the front room and he put the book in his music stand and he played the music on the silver flute sweetly and beautifully. Fabulous. When he finished, he looked at me and said, where did you find this? And I told him, and he said, I can hardly believe it, he said. Mr. Russell, I have an idea for you. Here are the stats for the rest of the week. Number of times I wanted to tell someone, 150,000. Number of people I told so far, 4. Lil Spicer, my mother, and my 2 brothers. Number of times I walked by the library hoping that Mr. Powell might be there, 12. Number of minutes off the record for finishing the Saturday deliveries for Spicy's Deli, 17. Mr. Loeffler didn't have any chores to do, so that did help. Number of minutes it took me to get to the dump before Spicer's Deli and then back to the library, 12. That was probably a record. Number of seconds it took me between coming to the library and Mrs. Merriam telling me not to run up the stairs, less than 1. Amount of time it took Mr. Powell to understand what I had, well, I think he's still working on that. So we laid the large bill puffin back in their place in Audubon's Bird of America. It came a little more whole than it had been before. Do you know how that feels? Do you think the fork-tailed petrels were dancing now? Not much more than Mr. Powell, who first danced around the room with me and then with Lil, and then we all went downstairs to tell Miss Merriam, and then he took her hands and he tried to dance with her, but she couldn't have any of that, even though I think she was smiling just a little the whole way. She was shushing him away. That night at supper, Lucas said he wanted to go to the library before it closed to see the puffins. Don't expect me to carry you up those stairs, said Ernie Echo, who was eating with us. Again. "Oh, we don't expect you," said Christopher. Ernie Echo looked up at him from his plate, and Christopher stared back. Ernie Echo looked down. "Once we get inside, there's an elevator," I said. Ernie Echo worked at his string beans. After supper, Christopher and I went with Lucas to the library. The days were finally starting to get longer, but it was still dark, and the first stars had been out for a while. Lucas looked up towards them as we went, squinting, blinking, trying to see. We carried the wheelchair up the stairs 6 at a time between the two of us, and it wasn't light. Then we lifted it over the doorframe and onto the marble floor of the library, where the wheels ran quiet and smooth. Mrs. Merriam looked up to see who had come in so late, and then she saw Lucas. She walked over from behind the desk, took off her loop glasses, and this didn't happen very often, and she said to Lucas, "Welcome home." I'm not lying. She said welcome home, like she was bringing him into her own kitchen or something. Lucas turned his face towards her and blinked. "Thanks, ma'am." "When did you get back?" she said, and he told her. "Where were you stationed?" "We were near Saigon. Were you near Saigon at all?" "When?" Lucas tried to remember. Then she asked him, "While you were there, did you ever hear of a Lieutenant Merriam? Lieutenant Leonard Merriam?" Lucas thought, then shook his head. I never did." He leaned down towards him and put her hand on his chair. "He was stationed near Saigon. You might have heard of him." Lucas shook his head again. "No, I'm sorry, ma'am." Mrs. Merriam stood up again. She twisted her hands together. "I didn't think you would have. I never really did." "Yeah, there were thousands of us guys over there." "I know, but your mother must be glad you're home." "Thanks," said Lucas. I told Miss Merriam that we were going up to see the book, and she went to the bottom of the stairs to turn the lights on, and she watched us as we got in the elevator. Lucas didn't exactly like the steel gate that we had to draw across, and he didn't really like the way the elevator rattled on its way up either, and he really, really didn't like the sound of the pulleys straining themselves. And of course, at the top of the elevator, as it stopped on a couple inches below the floor, we had to pull Lucas's chair over the lip. He was sweating and even shaky, but when we got to the room with the petrels and the puffins and everything else, then he wheeled himself over to the display case and looked at it. Mr. Powell left the book open to the large bill of puffins, and Lucas stared down at them for a long time, trying to make them out. "There's 2 of them, right?" He looked down again, and after a while he said, "Lieutenant Leonard Merriam is MIA." "How do you know that he's missing?" said Christopher. "Oh, I know." He leaned so close that his face was almost touching the glass. "Not everyone gets to see who they want to see again. I guess I'm lucky." Mrs. Merriam was waiting for us at the bottom of the stairs. She turned the lights out, and when we got down, she held the door open for us, and then I watched through the window. She went back to her desk, and she sat, put on her glasses, and looked at something a long way out from the library. Folks, that's the end of this chapter. I talked to you guys on the discussion board about the fact that a theme of this book is definitely okay for now. As much as I hate it when you guys always guess that theme, I definitely think you can say here. And once again, sorry, not okay for now, but a theme of this story is don't judge a book by its cover. I think, once again, that theme kind of applies to Miss Merriam, because I think Doug has definitely judged her a lot, and I think she has a story, and there's a reason why she's maybe acting the way she is. And we learn at the end of this chapter that she does have someone who is overseas right now in Vietnam and is currently, probably, as Lucas suggests, missing in action. I also want you guys to think about the courage it took for Doug to stand up to his brother Lucas when he literally tells him to shut up, and how sometimes tough love like that can be very, very powerful. And it certainly seemed to be work for Lucas, who instantly took off his bandage and started to heal again. Guys, that's all I have for tonight. But everybody take care. Please stay safe and keep enjoying your quarantine, everybody. Take care.